Joseph Stalin was one of the most powerful and controversial leaders of the 20th century, a man whose rule reshaped the Soviet Union and altered the course of global history. Born in 1878 in Gori, Georgia, then part of the Russian Empire, Stalin entered the world as Iosif Vissarionovich Djugashvili. His early life was marked by poverty, hardship, and violence. His father, a shoemaker, struggled with alcoholism, and his mother, deeply religious, hoped her son would become a priest. For a time, Stalin followed that path, enrolling in a religious seminary. However, it was there that he encountered revolutionary ideas that would define his future. Influenced by the writings of Karl Marx and inspired by the revolutionary movement led by Vladimir Lenin, Stalin abandoned religious studies and joined the Bolsheviks, a radical socialist group determined to overthrow the Tsarist regime. Throughout the early 1900s, he engaged in underground political activities, organizing strikes, spreading propaganda, and even participating in bank robberies to fund revolutionary efforts. He was arrested multiple times and exiled to Siberia, yet each time he returned to the struggle with greater determination. The Russian Revolution of 1917 provided the turning point he had been waiting for. When the Bolsheviks seized power, Stalin quickly positioned himself within the new government. Though not as charismatic as figures like Leon Trotsky, he proved exceptionally skilled in political maneuvering. In 1922, he became General Secretary of the Communist Party, a role that seemed administrative but allowed him to appoint loyal supporters to key positions. After Lenin's death in 1924, a fierce power struggle erupted within the party. Stalin methodically outmaneuvered his rivals, forming temporary alliances and then eliminating opponents one by one. By the late 1920s, Trotsky had been exiled, and Stalin emerged as the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. Once in control, he embarked on ambitious programs to transform the nation. Through a series of 5-year plans, Stalin pushed rapid industrialization, turning a largely agrarian society into an industrial power. Massive factories were constructed, and production of steel, coal, and machinery increased dramatically. However, this transformation came at an enormous human cost, as forced labor and harsh working conditions became widespread. At the same time, Stalin implemented collectivization of agriculture, consolidating individual farms into state-controlled collectives. Resistance was met with brutal repression, leading to widespread famine, particularly in Ukraine, where millions perished. Despite the suffering, Stalin consolidated his authority, reshaping Soviet society through both modernization and fear. As Stalin strengthened his grip on power, the 1930s became defined by an atmosphere of suspicion and terror that permeated every level of Soviet life. Determined to eliminate any potential threat to his authority, he launched what became known as the Great Purge. Between 1936 and 1938, thousands of party officials, military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were accused of treason, espionage, or counter-revolutionary activities. Public show trials were staged, where prominent figures confessed, often under torture, to fabricated crimes before being executed or sent to labor camps. The secret police, known as the NKVD, carried out mass arrests, and millions were dispatched to the Gulag system, a vast network of forced labor camps spread across remote regions of the Soviet Union. Fear became a powerful instrument of control. Neighbors denounced neighbors, and even loyal supporters of the regime lived in constant anxiety. Yet while repression intensified at home, Tensions were rising across Europe. In 1939, Stalin stunned the world by signing a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler, agreeing that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany would not attack each other. The agreement secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence and paved the way for the invasion of Poland, igniting World War II. However, in 1941, Hitler broke the pact and launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. The initial assault devastated Soviet forces, but Stalin mobilized the nation for total war. Industries were relocated eastward, soldiers were rallied with patriotic fervor, and the Red Army gradually regrouped. The brutal Battle of Stalingrad marked a decisive turning point, after which Soviet forces began pushing back German troops. By 1945, the Red Army had captured Berlin, and the Soviet Union emerged as one of the world's two superpowers alongside the United States. Stalin participated in wartime conferences with leaders such as Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, shaping the post-war order. After the war, he established communist governments across Eastern Europe, setting the stage for the Cold War. Domestically, repression continued, and the cult of personality surrounding Stalin reached its peak, portraying him as an infallible leader and father of the nation. When he died in 1953 after suffering a stroke, the Soviet Union was a formidable global power, yet deeply scarred by decades of fear and suffering. His legacy remains intensely debated, admired by some for industrializing the nation and leading it to victory in war, and condemned by others for the immense human toll of his rule. Stalin's life and rule cannot be understood without examining the machinery of propaganda and the cult of personality he built around himself. From the earliest years of his leadership, he understood that controlling perception was as important as controlling armies or factories. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and posters portrayed him as a heroic figure, the father of nations, wise and infallible. Education was tightly controlled. School children learned about his greatness alongside the basic curriculum. Literature and art were censored to glorify the regime. Every aspect of daily life reinforced the image of Stalin as the indispensable leader. This carefully constructed persona masked the reality of his rule, a reign of terror, suspicion, and ruthless pragmatism. Even those closest to him lived in fear of sudden arrest or execution. Friends, colleagues, and advisors could be accused of treason on the flimsiest of grounds. Loyalty was a fragile commodity, and betrayal could come from any direction. Yet, paradoxically, Stalin inspired genuine admiration among many citizens who saw him as the savior of the Soviet Union from foreign enemies, famine, and internal chaos. During the years of World War II, this admiration intensified. Stalin became the face of national resistance against Hitler's invasion. Photographs of him standing on the front lines, giving orders, and addressing troops circulated widely, creating a mythic figure who embodied the strength and resilience of the Soviet people. Soldiers and civilians alike believed in his vision of victory and survival. His personal decisions often had catastrophic consequences, but the propaganda shielded him from widespread criticism. Ordinary citizens were encouraged to report enemies of the state, contributing to a society where fear and devotion existed side by side. Even decades later, historians struggle to reconcile the industrial and military achievements of the Soviet Union under Stalin with the immense suffering his policies inflicted. The combination of charisma, propaganda, and terror created a system where questioning authority was dangerous, yet obedience could bring rewards. This duality defined life under Stalin, a life where hope and fear were inseparably intertwined. World War II was the ultimate test of Stalin's leadership, revealing both his strategic acumen and his ruthlessness. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Soviet Union was initially unprepared. Stalin had underestimated Hitler's ambitions, despite warnings from intelligence officers. The Nazi advance was rapid and brutal, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and devastating cities. Stalin's reaction was initially one of shock and disbelief. He retreated to his private residence and remained silent for several critical hours, an inaction that could have cost the Soviet Union its existence. Yet, once he recovered, Stalin acted decisively. He assumed complete control over military operations, reorganized the Red Army, and implemented a strategy of total war. Factories were dismantled and transported to the east, far from the reach of German bombs. Workers labored tirelessly to produce tanks, planes, and weapons, essential for the defense of the homeland. The Battle of Stalingrad became the symbol of Soviet resilience. It was a brutal, month-after-month struggle for control of a single city, marked by unprecedented casualties. The Red Army's eventual victory turned the tide of the war, forcing German forces into retreat. Stalin's role during this period was complex. He was both inspiring and feared. He demanded unwavering loyalty from generals, often executing those he suspected of incompetence or betrayal. Yet his leadership contributed directly to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. By May 1945, Soviet troops had entered Berlin, ending the European phase of World War. The second Stalin emerged as one of the most powerful figures on the planet, shaping post-war geopolitics at conferences with Roosevelt and Churchill. Despite this international prestige, Stalin's domestic policies remained harsh. Fear continued to permeate Soviet society. Even after victory, purges, arrests, and executions continued, ensuring that the centralization of power remained unchallenged. The transformation of Eastern Europe into a buffer zone of communist states marked the beginning of the Cold War, a global standoff that would dominate international relations for decades. Stalin's death in 1953 ended his personal reign of terror, but the systems he built, propaganda, political purges, and industrialization through centralized control, continued to influence Soviet society long after. His legacy is a mixture of immense achievement and unprecedented suffering, illustrating the dangerous potential of absolute power in human hands. Stalin's rule was defined not only by war and industrial transformation, but also by the deep social and cultural impact he had on the Soviet Union. Ordinary life was shaped by his policies, and every citizen became subject to the expectations and fears of a totalitarian state. Education, work, and even leisure were infused with ideology. Schools taught loyalty to the Communist Party and reverence for Stalin himself. History was rewritten to emphasize the inevitability of Soviet triumph, portraying Stalin as the guiding genius behind every victory. Art and literature were subjected to strict censorship, with the state dictating what could be published or performed. Writers and artists were expected to produce work that glorified socialism and celebrated the achievements of the Soviet state. Deviation from these standards could mean imprisonment, exile, or death. At the same time, Propaganda depicted the world outside the Soviet Union as hostile, a place of capitalist corruption and threats, reinforcing the need for unity under Stalin. Collective farms and industrial workplaces became centers of political surveillance, where citizens were encouraged to report dissent and maintain ideological conformity. Fear and propaganda created a complex society in which trust was scarce and personal ambition was inseparable from loyalty to the state. Yet, paradoxically, the same system also inspired pride among many Soviets who believed they were building a modern, powerful nation. The combination of progress and repression shaped the character of the Soviet Union for generations. Stalin's influence penetrated every corner of society. Even religion was suppressed, with churches closed, clergy persecuted, and atheist ideology promoted as central to Soviet identity. Family life was affected as well, as children were educated in youth organizations to uphold the values of the state. The private sphere became inseparable from political life, and personal choices were always scrutinized in the context of loyalty and ideology. Despite this, ordinary people continued to work, build, and survive, often demonstrating extraordinary resilience in the face of hardship. Stalin's era thus represents a paradox: immense progress in industrialization and military strength, yet achieved through fear, oppression, and sacrifice. The memory of these years continues to shape the way Russians and historians view both Stalin and the Soviet Union. His image, once larger than life, became inseparable from the collective experience of struggle, survival, and state control, leaving a legacy that remains both admired and condemned. The human cost of Stalin's policies cannot be overstated. Millions of lives were lost through famine, forced labor, political purges, and executions. The collectivization of agriculture, in particular, created catastrophic famine conditions in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and other regions. Peasants resisted the seizure of their lands and livestock, but Stalin's government responded with brutal force, labeling them enemies of the people. Villages were destroyed, entire populations were deported, and millions starved. Simultaneously, the Gulag system expanded dramatically. Prisoners, often convicted of minor or fabricated offenses, were sent to labor camps in Siberia and other remote areas. Conditions were harsh, with insufficient food, extreme weather, and back-breaking labor. Survival was uncertain, and many perished from exhaustion, disease, or exposure. The Great Purge of the late 1930s intensified the climate of fear. Party members, military leaders, and intellectuals were accused of plotting against the state. Public trials were held to demonstrate the consequences of disloyalty. Confessions were often coerced through torture, and sentences were swift and severe. Ordinary citizens learned that speaking out, even in private, could lead to arrest. Family members were not spared. Parents, children, and spouses were implicated in accusations of treason. The terror was systemic, penetrating every layer of society. Even the military, once a pillar of strength, was destabilized as senior commanders were executed or imprisoned, leaving the Red Army initially vulnerable during the early stages of World War. Despite these horrors, Stalin maintained popular support among some citizens who admired his vision, his ability to defeat enemies, and his role in industrializing the nation. Propaganda reinforced his image as a protector and provider. creating a tension between fear and admiration. This duality, reverence and terror, became a defining feature of life under Stalin. By the time of his death in 1953, the Soviet Union had transformed into a global superpower, capable of competing with the United States both militarily and politically. Yet, the price of this transformation was staggering, leaving a population traumatized and a society shaped by decades of oppression, surveillance, and ideological control. Stalin's legacy, therefore, is inseparable from both achievement and atrocity, reflecting the extremes of absolute power in human hands. Stalin's post-war policies were driven by a combination of strategic calculation and ideological ambition. After World War II, the Soviet Union had emerged as one of the two dominant superpowers on the global stage, and Stalin sought to secure its influence across Eastern Europe. Communist regimes were installed in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, often through coercion, rigged elections, and suppression of opposition. The Iron Curtain, a term that would later define the Cold War, descended across Europe, separating Soviet-controlled territories from Western democracies. Stalin's strategic vision was clear. Buffer zones and loyal governments would protect the Soviet Union from potential future invasions. Domestically, reconstruction after the war became a priority. Cities lay in ruins, and millions were displaced. The Soviet government embarked on a massive program to rebuild industry, transport, and housing, emphasizing rapid industrial growth over immediate improvements in living conditions. Labor camps continued to operate, with prisoners often forced into post-war reconstruction projects under harsh conditions. Despite the suffering, the Soviet Union achieved remarkable industrial output, becoming capable of competing militarily with the United States. The ideological dimension of Stalin's rule intensified during this period. He maintained strict control over political discourse, ensuring that criticism of the regime or its policies was punished. Propaganda reinforced the narrative of Soviet heroism in defeating fascism, and Stalin himself remained at the center of this narrative, portrayed as the genius strategist and fatherly figure of the nation. Internationally, Stalin negotiated from a position of strength, demanding security guarantees and recognition of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. This period also marked the early stages of the nuclear age, and Stalin understood the importance of scientific and technological advancement in maintaining global power. Education and scientific research were directed toward military and industrial objectives, with an emphasis on producing a highly skilled and ideologically loyal workforce. Despite the outward appearance of stability and progress, fear remained a constant element in Soviet life. Ordinary citizens were aware that dissent could lead to imprisonment, exile, or death. Families were encouraged to monitor each other, and workplace loyalty was enforced through surveillance and party oversight. The combination of propaganda, ideological control, and terror created a society in which compliance was both rewarded and demanded, and the memory of wartime sacrifices was leveraged to maintain loyalty to the state. Stalin's influence during this period thus shaped not only the geopolitical landscape but also the social and cultural fabric of the Soviet Union, leaving a legacy that would persist for decades. The later years of Stalin's life were marked by increasing paranoia and isolation. Even after the victory of World War II and the expansion of Soviet influence, Stalin remained suspicious of potential threats, both foreign and domestic. He scrutinized his closest advisors, generals, and party officials, fearing betrayal. The purges did not cease entirely, and arrests continued, though often less publicized than during the 1930s. Stalin's health declined in the late 1940s and early 1950s. but he maintained control through a network of loyal subordinates who enforced his directives. His decision-making became more erratic, influenced by mistrust and an obsession with security. Diplomatically, he confronted the emerging Cold War with a mixture of aggression and caution. Relations with the United States and Britain deteriorated as ideological differences and competing interests intensified. The Soviet Union sought to consolidate its influence in Eastern Europe, while simultaneously preparing for the possibility of armed conflict with the West. Domestically, Stalin continued to oversee economic and industrial policies aimed at maintaining Soviet strength. Heavy industry remained a priority, and the development of scientific and military capabilities was relentless. Education and culture were strictly controlled, emphasizing loyalty, patriotism, and devotion to socialism. Religion remained suppressed, and traditional social structures were subordinated to state objectives. Even as the population recovered from the devastation of war, fear and obedience were central to daily life. Stalin's personal life remained largely private, but reports suggest that he became increasingly reclusive, rarely meeting with ordinary citizens and relying on intermediaries to communicate with officials. He demanded unwavering loyalty, often testing subordinates through complex political maneuvers or sudden reprimands. This atmosphere of distrust created tension and uncertainty, reinforcing the perception that Stalin's power was absolute, yet fragile. When he suffered a stroke in March 1953, it highlighted the extent to which fear and protocol had governed even routine interactions. Reportedly, no one immediately entered his room to provide aid. His death marked the end of an era, but the structures he had built, centralized control, surveillance, propaganda, and ideological conformity, remained deeply entrenched. The Soviet Union emerged from his rule transformed, a global superpower, industrially advanced, militarily formidable, yet politically repressive. Stalin's life and legacy remain subjects of intense debate among historians and scholars, illustrating the complexities of absolute power, human ambition, and the consequences of leadership defined by both vision and terror. The historical debate over Stalin's rule is complex and often polarized. Some historians emphasize his role as a transformative leader who turned a backward agrarian society into an industrial and military powerhouse capable of defeating Nazi Germany and competing with the United States on the world stage. His 5-year plans achieved industrial output unprecedented in Russian history, and his emphasis on centralized planning and scientific development laid the foundation for the Soviet Union's later achievements, including advances in space exploration and nuclear technology. Others focus on the immense human cost of his policies, arguing that no accomplishment can justify the suffering of millions. Famines, purges, forced labor, and executions left scars that lasted for generations, and the psychological and cultural impact of fear permeated Soviet society long after his death. Scholars continue to debate whether Stalin's methods were necessary to achieve rapid industrialization and global power, or whether they reflected the excesses of a paranoid dictator unconstrained by morality. Even within Russia, views of Stalin remain divided. Some admire him as a strong leader who defended the nation during World War II and secured its place as a global superpower. Monuments, museums, museums and commemorative events in certain regions celebrate his achievements. Others condemn his legacy, emphasizing the scale of human suffering and the authoritarian nature of his rule. This duality reflects the broader question of leadership. Can the ends justify the means when millions of lives are at stake? Stalin's life exemplifies the dangers of concentrated power and the potential for ideology, propaganda, and fear to reshape society. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the responsibilities of leadership and the ethical limits of political ambition. Understanding Stalin requires grappling with these contradictions. A man capable of extraordinary vision and organization, yet also responsible for unparalleled oppression and cruelty. This tension defines much of 20th century history, as the Soviet Union's rise as a superpower was inseparable from the human cost of Stalin's methods.